Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kabatahway. Well, on this week's show, we'll be looking at the economy of Cuba and ascertain just how the island nation in the Caribbean is reforming its private sector to assist the flow of income to the people of Cuba. Well, the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro in 1953, took 5 years to oust then-President Fulgencio Batista, is still in place today, which on a political scale saw the U.S. very nervous of its communist neighbor, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Yet today sees the revolution as part of the brand of Cuba. However, a major impact on the Cuban economy are U.S.-imposed sanctions on the state, which along with the impact of the COVID-19 virus, saw Cuba's GDP fall by some 11% since the start of the year 2020. And along with the state governing most enterprises has given Cuba a very low score on the Index of Economic Freedom, as shown in this chart, showing the score sinking to just 26.9 points. Well, by not having a significant flow of foreign currencies, Cuba has stumbled on a difficult situation, as the nation, for example, imports around 70 to 80% of its food, which, as we can see on this chart, shows just how much of each food commodity is imported to the nation, with the bulk of imports coming to Cuba from Venezuela and also from China. Let's now look into our first report that studies how Cuba's revolution has been given a brand identity and how it has been able to adapt and reform to suit the current economic climate.
In 1953, a young Fidel Castro gathered together a group of similar-minded people and over the next 5 years ousted then-President Fulgencio Batista. The Cuban Revolution is without doubt one of the most successful and bizarrely one of the most popular in the world, with teams of tourists flocking to the Caribbean island to immerse themselves in the atmosphere of La Revolucion, adorning the Che Guevara berets, posing with classic cars, and losing themselves in the vibrant music and culture of the island. But the modern image of luscious beaches, Cuban cigars and cocktails has not always been the norm. The notion of communism left the United States very edgy, particularly during the 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis, sparking American nuclear families to build up an image of almost alien-like views of communism, which contributed to even more tension during the height of the Cold War. Yet the revolution has delivered Cuba with an economic dilemma. The US-imposed embargo on the nation has cost its financial status heavily, with some estimates placing the monetary value of the sanctions at around £553 billion, according to the Cubans. And the UN have estimated the value at a more conservative $130 billion over the last 6 decades.
Joining me in the studio is current affairs and impact analyst Mahan Abedin. Welcome. And
Thank
Dr.
you.
Stephen Wilkinson from the University of Buckingham. He is also the director of the International Institute for the Study of Cuba. Well, gentlemen, thanks for being with us. Let me start with Professor Dr. Wilkinson. Cuba's revolution, it has molded itself over the years to be adaptable. And today you have the Cuban government who has hinted at lifting the grip on the private enterprises. And there's so many that they run, hence allowing Cubans to seek extra income that they obviously need. And of course, the reforms need to come in place. Do you think that this is an example of communism meeting like capitalism, which was embraced somewhat by the Chinese model in a sense? And could it be the perfect balance between the two ideologies for Cuba?
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Kaveh. Yes, I mean, to answer your question immediately, one would say that perhaps the secret of Cuba's success in the face of the opposition it's had from the United States over the years is its adaptability and its pragmatic approach to dealing with its problems. I would say that the changes you're referring to have been going on for quite some time. In fact, since the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991, Cuba has been moving towards using market mechanisms in order to solve some of the problems inside the society and the economy.
All right, Mahan, the
Yeah.
Cuban Revolution, it has
Yes.
survived, and we could talk about the death of its founder, Fidel Castro.
Yes.
Now, what do you think are the main reasons that this ideology has lived for so long, in spite of the virtual fall of communism elsewhere? And do you think that a socialist economy is actually a viable model for the island nation to thrive on financially, in this case Cuba?
Well, Cuba really demonstrated its resilience when it outlived the former Soviet Union, because everyone was saying because their economy was so dependent on the Soviets and they had direct aid from the Soviet Union, it would immediately collapse. It hasn't. In fact, it's gone on to thrive. It's been there for 60 years. And also some of the innovative things they've done in recent years. They've opened up the economy to some extent. There's now some scope for private enterprise in Cuba, but it's still a very strictly socialist country. They've opened up the internet, and of course the tourism sector is picking up. So Cuba really is a resounding success story, particularly in view of its immediate environment. You know, a very hostile giant neighbor to the north, which has tried to oust them repeatedly in the past 60 years, particularly in the early decades. I mean, they tried to assassinate Fidel Castro for over a dozen times, but they were unsuccessful. So Cuba, yeah, by all accounts, by all credible accounts and standards, it really is a resounding success story.
Yeah, it sure is, from the sounds of it anyways. Okay, thanks to both Mahan and Dr. Wilkinson. We're going to obviously see them later again in the program. It's time now to take a look at our second report that studies Cuba's rocky relationship with its northern neighbor, namely the U.S.
We've already touched on the situation during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, but ties between Cuba and the US have frozen and thawed on several notable occasions. The most obvious differences in ties came between the US and Cuba depending on the US government at the time, with the Democrats tending to be more favourable towards Cuba than the Republicans, as demonstrated in 1999, when then-President Bill Clinton allowed travel restrictions to be eased between the two nations, even going as far as approving cultural and sporting exchanges. The election of George W. Bush saw relations deteriorate again, with the US government labelling Cuba in its baseless axis of evil speech, spearheaded by the sinister and hawkish advisor John Bolton. But it's in 2008, when Fidel Castro officially stood down and Barack Obama became president of the US, that tensions thawed the most, and the two countries saw their best relations in years, with Obama easing many sanctions and even travelling to Havana to meet Raul Castro. Obama also lifted the label of Cuba as being a state sponsor of terrorism and promised to close the infamous Guantanamo Bay base, a promise that Obama never managed to keep. Donald Trump in his final weeks in office, however, reversed Obama's work and once again placed Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism and once again created tension between the two sides. Yet in spite of the political to and fro between the two, it's the people of Cuba that have seen the real impact of sanctions, with around 15% of people in Cuba living in poverty and the rest unable to make ends meet as well as they would like to. How then have the sanctions affected the daily lives of people in Cuba?
So there's the contradiction. In many ways, Cuba behaves very much as a developed country in terms of its commitment to health, education. People can talk in great detail and at great length about the contributions that Cuba has made to its own people in those terms, or the Cuban government has made. The other side of that, however, is precisely what you're talking about, and that is the prolonged effect of the longest sanctions, economic sanctions in world history, over 60 years. And that has done many things at a sort of, macro level. It has completely distorted the Cuban economy, and Cubans at street level feel that fragility and feel that sense of precarious existence, certainly. I mean, there is food on the tables, nobody is starving, but it's a very kind of piecemeal approach to trying to get that food on the table.
What now remains to be seen is whether the upcoming reforms in Cuba that will allow more private enterprise with less control by the state, will it give the people of Cuba an opportunity to earn more money? Yet with tourism being a major source of foreign currency and opportunity for private businesses, it seems that until the global COVID-19 pandemic is brought under control, things may yet remain very challenging for the people and the government of Cuba.
Back with me in the studio is Mahan Abedin and Dr. Stephen Wilkinson. Welcome back to both of you. Dr. Wilkinson, the U.S. under Donald Trump, he reimposed sanctions on Cuba, labeled it a state sponsor of terrorism. Do you think the new President Joe Biden is going to be following the footsteps of Barack Obama in terms of easing ties with Cuba? And will Biden finally close the prison at Guantanamo Bay, as he has hinted at recently?
Well, Kaveh, just to go back to your first question, to begin the answer to this one, around the issue of ideology, I think one of the most important things to understand about this relationship with the United States is that the underlying, if you want to use a philosophical term, the episteme, that means the kind of the underlying basis of this confrontation, it is not seen the same way on both sides. So, for example, the United States almost consistently insists on seeing this as a relationship which is based around a conflict between socialism and capitalism. Whereas if you ask the average Cuban what they see the confrontation as being one between colonialism and independence.
Well, Mahan, it seems that the U.S. Is content on slapping economic sanctions pretty much on any nation that does not wish to follow its ideology. And of course, not only Cuba, you have Venezuela, and of course here in Iran, they're all on the list. Yet, in spite of these sanctions, all nations have shown resilience. Cuba is one, Iran for sure another, and they have shown some notion towards improving or economic improvements. Now, do you think Cuba, like Iran and Venezuela, have stood up successfully when it comes to sanctions and proving that they just don't really have the impact that, in this case, the U.S. intended to?
Well, I think sanctions in all the three cases you pointed out, at least Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba, what it tends to do is to actually improve national cohesion in these countries. So there may be an element of economic suffering, but people pull together. And that in itself defeats the sanctions, because one of the primary aim of these sanctions is not only just to economically cripple a country, but to actually incite unrest. And it clearly hasn't happened in any of these countries. And I'd just like to pick up on what your colleague just said, that the US really is stuck in a prism in terms of how it deals with countries like Cuba, and in some ways, especially in relation to Cuba specifically, the US is hostage to that very powerful lobby in Florida, the so-called Cuban lobby. But of course, it's not a Cuban lobby. It's all these American not jobs lobby, which tend to view the Cuban system through the prism of the Cold War. And again, your guest is partially right, I think. Yeah, there is a nationalistic element in the Cuban Revolution, but we can't downplay its socialist elements. And the socialist element, which I hope we will be able to discuss later in your show, has underpinned its success in the health sector, because Cuba has one of the most advanced health sectors in the world. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Many thanks to Mahan and also Dr. Wilkinson. Well, we're about to take a short break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere, as we have plenty more coming up after these short messages, so stay right where you are. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kaveh Tafwai. Time now to take a look at some of the other economic headlines hitting the front pages in our Info News section. Well, first up, China has taken its first step to ousting the U.S. as the world's largest economy by overtaking the Americans as the European Union's largest trading partner. Figures show that trade between China and the EU is valued at $709 billion compared to $671 billion for the U.S. in the year 2020. Well, Bitcoin has breached the iconic $50,000 mark, seeing the currency rise by 72% since the start of the year. Well, the price surge comes following an announcement by Tesla CEO Elon Musk that he had purchased $1.5 billion of the cryptocurrency. However, critics say that the fluctuation still makes the currency an unstable commodity. Next up, following from our episode on billionaires last week, two of the world's richest men, namely Jeff Bezos and Mukesh Ambani, are battling over a $3.4 billion contract over retail sales in India. Bezos' Amazon hopes to gain a slice of the 1,800 retail stores across 420 Indian cities. However, Ambani's reliance is showing Amazon that local knowledge and ready cash are strong enough to oust Amazon's interest in India. And finally, the mining company Rio Tinto has announced that it is expected to pay out a record $9 billion in dividends following a 20% rise in profit due to China's demand for iron ore. Well, the payout will be the world's second largest mining company's largest ever payout in its 148-year history. Well, it's time now to take a look at our final report of the show, which examines the possible routes out of the red for Cuba, looking at how certain industries and trade may pick up again in the near future.
With tensions in the past rising and falling in parallel with respective US governments at the time, the future economic situation in Cuba may depend in part on the ambitious and political economic foreign policy of current President Joe Biden. However, it's not just politics that dictate just how the Cuban economy will fare in the near future. As we've briefly touched upon earlier in the show, one of the main sources of foreign currency income to Cuba is the flow of tourism, with visitors to the island rising from under 750,000 in 1995 to over 4.6 million in 2018, and contributing to around 3% of the total GDP. With the potential reforms on private enterprise also taking place in Cuba, the future looks quite bright. However, as with the rest of the world, there's a huge hurdle to cross first. The COVID-19 virus has not impacted Cuba as heavily as other places, with the island managing the spread of the virus relatively well. However, international travel, aviation and tourism has suffered extremely heavy losses at the hand of the virus, and the impact has literally meant that Cuban tourism is closed for now. Many Cubans currently rely on remittances sent to the island from the US, and with over 2.3 million Cubans living in America, the opportunity to send money home is plenty. Yet in the long term, it's not an ideal solution. However, Cuba has shown that it's able to manage well in times of crisis, as demonstrated by its handling of the virus, and with a highly educated population boasting 100% literacy rates from both males and females, and having some of the best medical doctors in the world, Cuba has shown the world how self-sufficient it can be. So the future now lies in the hands of both the people and the government of Cuba, as well as partly in the hands of external partners and nations, meaning how the people of Cuba view their future, either tied to better relations with the US, or by seeking more ties with new or existing partners, depends what happens on a political scale, and now it seems medically, in order to emerge from the current situation.
Cuba's always looked elsewhere. It's always tried to keep those international alliances going, and a huge part of that for over 30 years, but predominantly now, principally now with the pandemic, has been through internationalism, through medical internationalism and the exchange of medical expertise, or pharmaceuticals in exchange for basic commodities. In terms of the change of US administration, I don't think it could have got worse for Cuba than it had been under Trump. The number of restrictions that were strengthened under Trump's administration, including remittances, including limiting the most obvious tourist market, which is the US market, severely limiting that. And then one of his last acts before leaving office was to put Cuba on the what used to be the axis of evil. So it can't get worse than that. It can't be harder than that.
I'm pleased to welcome back one more time current affairs and impact analyst Mahan Abedin and director of the International Institute for the Study of Cuba from the University of Buckingham, Dr. Stephen Wilkinson. Gentlemen, welcome back. Dr. Wilkinson, my final question. Cuba, like many other nations around the world, suffered heavily at the hands of the COVID-19, not necessarily in the number of deaths, which currently stands at less than 300, but also more so due to the impact of the virus on the tourism of the country. Do you feel that in spite of the 11% GDP slump that was recorded in 2020 by Cuba, that the economy can reemerge from the pandemic and get back to its former self?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. I'm talking to you from a country which has suffered a very similar fall in GDP, Great Britain, and we don't know what our economy will look like going forward. So it's very difficult to predict in terms of how this pandemic is going to play out. I would say that it is the case that Cuba's economy has been heavily switched towards tourism as one of the main foreign currency earners. And it's hard to see, in terms of the global pandemic, a return to the kinds of tourism that we had in the past coming back to Cuba very quickly. So one would say on that count, the picture is not very let's say optimistic for Cuba at this stage. However, On the other hand, one of the other main planks of the Cuban economy now, and arguably one of its most successful projects, has been the development of its biotechnology industry. And in that, there is a great deal of optimism for Cuba. Cuba has developed 4 candidate vaccines against the coronavirus, and they're going to come on stream within the next few weeks. And Cuba has the capacity to manufacture 100 million doses of this very quickly. Now, that means that Cuba could become a key global player in dealing with this pandemic, in particularly in developing countries. And if the vaccines that Cuba have produced are effective, then Cuba could become extremely important and benefit enormously from the pandemic in this regard.
Okay, many thanks to Dr. Stephen Wilkinson, Director of the International Institute for the Study of Cuba and lecturer at the University of Buckingham. It was great having you on Economic Divide.
Thank you.
All right, Mahan, Cuba has done very well in controlling the coronavirus, respectively, regarding its compared to other nations. Do you think that having a well-educated population, which it does, has contributed to this feat? And is education the key to reignite the Cuban economy? I mean, after all, Cuba can't rely on just tourism or its for its sole economic pillar.
Well, I think, in short, it's Cuba's health sector that's ensured it's weathered the storm in relation to COVID-19. As I stated earlier, it has one of the best health systems in the world. It used to export doctors and nurses throughout the so-called third world, particularly in Africa. So it's not a surprise at all that Cuba has this capacity to produce 100 million doses of the coronavirus, not only to look after its own population, but then to export that to other parts of the world. Look, Cuba is a very resilient country. I mean, education is a part of it, but let's face it, this is a country that's withstood a decade of US hostility. It survived the downfall of the former Soviet Union, which was its close ally during the Cold War. It's weathered all sorts of storms, and it stood tall for 60 years. So, I think the system there is very resilient. Cuba will come out of this stronger, I believe. And also, again, from a health perspective, at least a public health perspective, it will continue to set an example for the rest of the world. Let's not forget, this is a tiny country, and yet it's had so many dramatic achievements in the health sector, but also, I hasten to add, in the educational sector as well.
Great, thank you so much for that. We do appreciate it, Mahan.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's Mahan Abedin there. Thank you. And Dr. Stephen Wilkinson also. It was great to hear from both of them. Time now for 1,000 words. The Cuban Revolution has so far stood the test of time, with not only the founder of the revolution dead, but also with communism morphing into a very different concept since the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the fall of the Soviet Union. Yet it is the very revolution that has given Cuba an identity, a brand, with tourists flocking to the island to sample the music, the culture, and of course, embrace a taste of the revolution through the purchase of Che Guevara merchandise as a prime example. Yet for Cuba, the notion of fighting economic sanctions imposed by the US, as well as seeing one of its main sources of income dry up due to the COVID-19 pandemic, limited travel to Cuba and has proven to take its toll on the country, hence forcing to adapt its business ideology to allow its citizens to gain private wealth. What now remains to be seen is just how successful this plan becomes and whether future relations between Cuba and the US and the rest of the world can bring back much needed foreign investment into the country. That's about all the time we have on this episode. On behalf of myself, Kavitha Wei, and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you again next time.